GM, and welcome to Numbers Therapy, episode 34. Today's episode titled The Battle of Social Media. We'll see what that's all about. A couple housekeeping points before we dive in. Here in 2023, of course, first episodes of the year, and we'll be featuring advisors and some other excellent folks as part of January curriculum, as many of you know. Today's a perfect example of that, where we have an advisor in today. So it's really going to be some great next level curriculum. Very excited to share it with you and join as part of the overall curriculum that we have. Similarly, we're working on building some additional structure and categories for episodes too, so be on the lookout for that as well. For those unfamiliar, we're on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts in case you miss an episode, and continue to appreciate all the feedback that's given. Again, nothing sacred here. This is an MVHQ product. It's designed for everyone here. So please, keep your eyes open as well. We're going to have an updated plan and an approach for that. Should be pretty cool as well. Lastly, if you have any dream topics or guests, please send them across, and the team will, of course, consider them. We're getting some great folks. So please, dream big, say who you want, what topics you want to hear about. We'd love to hear that. That would definitely help. For framing purposes, the purpose of Numbers Therapy is to talk through the macro, showcase the best of Web3, discussing the wider thought, strategy, and nuance that most other folks are not talking about. Specifically, our goal for all of our audience and everyone here is ensure that everyone understands how all the big pieces fit together, plus where the Web3 world is likely to go. Help everyone make better decisions with NFTs and other investments, including time investments, using a balanced perspective. Learn about different areas and opportunities, plus different ways of thinking, and provide a sneak peek behind the curtain of our guests, their processes, and their paths. That helps give wider context beyond what we normally hear. Also, as a reminder, Numbers Therapy is designed intentionally for all levels. So we're going to go through and define terms and go through the 101 and then progress to more advanced concepts. But if you have any questions along the way, for the live audience, we have guest questions, chat. Please drop the questions in there. I'll make sure to bring them in the appropriate place. But even if they're intro questions, acronyms, definitions, or if you have more advanced questions, don't be shy, drop them in. I'm sure somebody else has the question, so that would be very helpful. And lastly, important note and disclaimer, none of what you hear in here is financial advice. It's all opinions. So without further ado, and on to today's guest in episode. Today's guest is a newly joined MVHQ advisor. Very excited to have her on here. She comes from marketplaces at one point, which then evolved to social media, which needless to say will be on many people's minds here. We see you two hot tub flippers as we're talking about marketplaces. She's also majorly cut her teeth as an NFT trader and investor, so totally has experience and opinions there as well. I think today's conversation will form an excellent foundation for us about how social media and Web3 are intersecting, especially at this uncertain phase across platforms. Topics like Twitter, Instagram, Coinbase's interface, Mastodon, all in scope. I think it should be a pretty interesting conversation. So without further ado, please welcome Julia to the stage, everyone. Julia, how you doing today?
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for the really warm intro.
GM, exactly. Happy to have you on and totally deserving. So first off, common first question or two and ritual that we tend to have in here. Can you tell us a bit about your pre-Web3 background before you got into NFT land? What kinds of things were you focusing on? Where was your attention?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Happy to share a bit more about my background pre-Web3. Honestly, just like everyone else, dive super deep in the Web2 space. So I a little bit about myself. I grew up in the East Coast, went to school there, and started my career in consulting. Worked in a few big consulting firms over in the East Coast, focusing more on the traditional companies and corporations, client services, and then had an opportunity to move to Seattle and working for Amazon. So that was a few years ago, and had a really great experience there, focusing on the marketplaces, e-commerce, and then some of the latest technology, including the Alexa Echo devices. I helped launch that product line a few years ago, and did a lot of marketing campaigns for them. Some of you might have seen that on TV and on all the social media. And then fast forward to 2018, fortunately, I was able to join, at that time it was called Musical.ly, which is now the TikTok that you've probably all heard of, and to lead a growth organization there. And yeah, it's been a fun journey. But I think just because all this experience I have, I think that allowed me to be always in the forefront on what's coming up, what's the latest technology, what's trending in the space, what people are caring about. And because of what I do, right, it's really the intersection between technology, art, entertainment, media, and everything else. So, which is what brought me into this Web3 NFT space. In I think 2021, that's when I first got really exposed to NFT. I have some experience with crypto side of things. Back in I think 2012, a good friend of mine was mining Bitcoin, co-worker / good friend at that time, and I just started listening to what he was saying every day, what he did. Unfortunately, I didn't mine Bitcoin with him at that time. I think my life will be really different right now. But it was a fun and really great first exposure to the blockchain. And over the years, I've been just following the news and start investing a bit more, I think 2016, 17, but more passively, right? Just like how we diversify our investment portfolio. So, and then just really not until 2021 that later how 2021 when NFTs really booming. And myself, I live in LA. There are just so many events that you could go to. So my friends start asking me, "Hey, Julia, come over Hollywood, Venice Beach, right? All these meetups." So that was really fun. And then had my first exposure to the big conference on, I think, fall of 2021, the NFT NYC. And that was really eye-opening for me as well. So yeah, so that's a bit of, and then, just the rest is history, right? We all here. And I wouldn't say I'm a super active DGen, but I think compared to the general public, I probably know a little bit more about this space than others in the Web2 corporate. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background.
That's awesome background. Thank you for that. I realized after asking that, and hey, it almost sounded like a job interview there, which is definitely not the intent. But really, really great to have the background, because I think it helps everyone understand, where you came from, how you connected into NFTs. I also think there's this really cool tension that we're going to talk about maybe today about, where we're at with social media right now. And, you happen to be certainly ahead of the curve. And I think probably personally, many people within, Web2 social media companies are ahead of the curve. But organizationally, several of them are not, or maybe behind, right? So I think there's this really cool tension that exists. I guess before we keep going, I'll just make you feel good for a second here, which is for your story of not mining. I also had a story that I think I've shared once or twice, which is a while back, at the similar point to what you said, 2012. There was an affiliate program that existed where you'd earn points, or actually airline miles for staying in hotels. So kind of a crossover that existed. And at one point in the beginning, they were offering Bitcoin as one of their rewards. So all you had to do is flip it over, which I actually had considered. I remember considering at one point, just flip it on as your earn preference. You would have earned something like, for a Bitcoin per dollar spent or something, right? So you're envisioning like, a $1,500 hotel stay for work, for instance.
Yeah.
Which probably would have resulted in 1,500 BTC.
Oh,
so there you
sure.
go. That makes you feel any better. And
yeah,
I'm sorry the stories.
Yeah, but I think at that time, right, the cost of getting that ready it's high, right? Not cost itself. I'm just saying like the complexity of it, right? I think that's, I guess nowadays we call it the barrier of entry, right? Barrier of entry is really high back then. So I think that's what prevents a lot of people from, set up a wallet and how do you do it, right? It's just not as easy as what we have today. One click on Coinbase MetaMask, you can get a wallet ready and then share it to people. I think back then was just very difficult. So and when you mentioned this hotel thing, I think that one friend I told you mine Bitcoin. I remember, I think a few years after when you start seeing some of the vendors or retailers start accepting cryptocurrency, right? And so we went to this food truck in Seattle, outside of our Amazon office, and they were selling grilled sandwich, and then they were accepting Bitcoin. So my friend was actually paying all the sandwiches with his Bitcoin every time we meet up for lunch. So, now you think about it, how much those sandwiches were worth. The grilled cheese is probably worth, 5,000 each piece.
Yeah, I think one of the common threads that like a good percentage of folks in MVHQ at least have is, some chunk of the folks have some version of this story, having missed out or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And are saying to themselves, of course, with the rise of Web3 and NFTs, like, this is not going to happen again. I'm not missing it again. So that's the part of the motivating force, I feel like.
For sure.
So when you got into the NFT space originally, obviously, you'd always explored emerging technologies. That's kind of why you got into, ByteDance originally, and then became TikTok, that whole thing. What was your initial reaction to NFTs? Was it logical for you? Did you have to convince yourself? We tend to hear like all sorts of different reactions depending upon the person's background of how logical NFTs were, or, were they kind of convinced? Were they not at all convinced? Like, where was your head originally?
I think in the beginning, I was definitely, I was never really much of like a collector of anything, right? Shoes or anything else. So, for me, I was intrigued, but I didn't really have a lot of skepticism like what some people have today, right? I was just curious. Okay, so what is this? Okay, it's those pictures, right, that you can trade and sell. But I am certainly familiar with concept trading, card trading, and all sort of things. I was just never a participant for any of that. So when I first got introduced to this, I'm like, okay, well, that's just another version of it, except you have trading different type of things, different the digital asset using cryptocurrency. And blockchain technology, right, to generate them. So I think for me, I was intrigued, but I wasn't like, I shouldn't even touch this by any means. For me, I'm like, okay, I mean, and the events are usually fun, right? And plus, that's kind of relates to what I was already doing in Web2 world. So I was very open-minded when I first got introduced to this. And I remember when I first heard about the price of the punks, I was like, oh, okay, wow, that's that expensive. And then at one point I was in a meeting with someone, and the Zoom background, that person had a picture of that. I was like, oh, wow. And then someone else said, yeah, that thing is worth, I forgot, it was like a couple $1,000s at that time. So that was like one of my first exposure to NFT. But yeah, for me, I was just, curious, and which is what happened, right? I ended up going to the meetups, and then I think that NFT NYC events really was the most eye-opening events I would say for me. Seeing all these communities get together, people wait in line to get into like the Bored Ape events, right? The Cool Cats party. I don't know if any of you went in 2021. People just wait outside in the cold for hours to get into this little bar upstairs in Times Square. And then what I was thinking was, wow, this community is so passionate. What made them want to do that, stand in the cold, like doing this? What made them fly all the way to New York City, spend a couple $100s a night and stay in Times Square, and then participating in all these community events? So I think that's really got me really intrigued and wanted to learn more.
Funny enough, I remember the exact Cool Cats party that you're talking about. Yes, Ginzo and crew went into, but I didn't. I was online for an hour and a half, and I just
wow, really?
We were freezing the exact party.
Fortunately, I know someone, so again, right, I just, if I had to wait that long, I wouldn't, probably 30 minutes tops, right? I will leave. So I did go up, and I was, just seeing what they're doing. It's interesting, yeah. And then people like having all the pins out, right? Talking about Cool Cats, yeah, for sure. It's quite an experience.
I'm at some point, Jinzo or somebody's going to send me a message and like lambaste me for not greasing the bouncer and just kind of stepping to the front. But nonetheless, the story's out, and here we are. So,
Right.
So I think an interesting question that Jinzo coincidentally is asking that's pretty parallel to what you were just talking about with when you heard about NFTs and explored it the first time, is similarly like, with your work, you had that point where you heard about, what eventually became TikTok, right? It was ByteDance, I think originally, right? Eventually became. What was your thought process there when you heard about it? Like, I'm sure there also you had to be convinced that this was going to be a thing such that you were willing to attach to it, right? So maybe not as out there and foreign as NFTs and Web3 technology, which is a bit different since other social media platforms existed. However, as we all know, there's been a slew of social media platforms before that have not been successful, right? So, what was it that convinced you? What was your thought process like before joining on there?
Yeah, great question. That was my decision back in 2018. Why? I think it's a mix of different reasons. First, I looked at the platform at that time. I don't know any of you honestly used Musical.ly at that time. It was mostly lip syncing or teenage girls dancing in front of the camera. So it's a little bit cringy, to be honest. Not the type of social media I would want to look at. And honestly, we call it entertainment platform on social media because you're not there to connect with your friends. You really go there to watch content. So for me, when I first learned about this app, I think I first learned about it in just through other channels, not through an interview. When I actually interview with them, I know, okay, so this is the app that I saw it before. But I was never I think I had an account a few years even back before I had the interview, but used it maybe twice, and that's it. So for me, it wasn't something that I was like, oh, that's so exciting, that's the next big thing. But I certainly saw the potential there, that, hey, all these people, it's the community we're talking about today, right? When you're on the platform, you see the same type of people showing up again and again. So just gotta be some kind of community there that people, like-minded people, similar interest, similar passion, right? In really similar maybe demographic as well, that get together in the same place, same time. So I kind of saw that coming. I was like, okay, this might be the next big thing. But you never know, right? Because there's so many different versions of social media or content platforms out there. And then I went to, I think, VidCon, which is, some of you might have heard of. VidCon is this conference they have every summer in Anaheim, Disneyland here, that a lot of YouTubers, influencers get together. So I went there that year, and then I've been there like a few times, and then there's always events hosted by Musical.ly. So I got to learn a little bit more about the company. And at the same time, right, in Asia, there's a different version of TikTok that's already really popular, and the platform was booming and a lot of people watching it. So that variety, all these reasons all together. And plus, personally, I want to move to LA. I was in Seattle, miserable with this rain, just like what we have here in LA the past 2 weeks. So with all those reasons, I'm like, okay, let me just take a chance, right? It's a startup. We had just a few dozen people in the company at the time. Nothing like the skill here. There's nothing to lose. For me, I think I have had a pretty good resume at the time already. So even joining a startup, if it doesn't work, I always head it up. I can always go somewhere else. So I think for me, it's I came in just with taking some risk, seeing a bit of potential in terms of growth. And and personally, I want to move to LA. So with all of that, I know I had to take this role.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's actually like a pretty valuable, small point that was in there too that I think is worth calling out as well, which is, you said you kind of explored this was being used in China, that kind of a thing. And, as we look at verticals, right, and I'd love to hear your thoughts here, but as we look at verticals, right, certainly technology, social media, I came from, at least part of my background was financial services and payments, with apparel even, and like clothing trends. A lot of those things come from Asia, Europe, and they're ahead of us, in the US least by a long shot in many cases. So like I feel like again, this is just my perspective, right? And what I've learned, but I feel like the expectation and thought is that a lot of the things come first from the US, when in reality, I think there's, I don't want to say like arbitrage, but some arbitrage that exists because in fact, it comes from a lot of other places. And if you just, like you did, look at other places first, Asia, Europe, and see what the trends are there, you might have a good sense of what could come in the US if it can get adopted, of course. Do you find that to be the case in general? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that 100% because, I think yes, we say, okay, just developed country and developing country, right? We call it emerging markets. But with today's technology, everyone, especially like mobile apps, for example, right? So many people have mobile devices that there's not that much of a difference between how we use it here versus, in the emerging countries. So plus they usually have more dense population right there. So if it works there, I think there's a high chance that it will work, here or Europe and elsewhere. So I certainly see that. I love how you point out the payments, right? How mobile payment has been going around for years in Asia, and I'm glad we finally catch up here in the U.S. During COVID, and then live streaming is another thing, right? It's been going on for a long time in Asia, in some other emerging markets too, and now we are slowly catching up. And so I agree. I think maybe 30 years ago it wasn't this case, right? US, we are leading in tech, in innovation, but today I think beyond just innovation, a lot of in terms of convenience, right? I think convenience is something that I don't think we talk about that much in technology, but it's a strong driver for to accelerate a lot of the technology. Right, like payment, just perfect example right there. And then having a phone makes content more accessible than using a laptop or TV. So, and that's what they are good at and what they leverage on, in those emerging markets. So I agree.
You trigger, another example of that, right? Another small example of that would be, and it's like funny to say in hindsight, but QR codes, which were adopted like everywhere in the world forever.
Right.
And only recently in the US did it become a thing where you didn't get the question of like, how do I use this or what do I do? Right. It's only like a couple of years probably that it's been somewhat widely used here. So.
That is so true. That's so true. Even when I'm doing marketing here for what I do, right? If you do marketing for Asia markets for the same products, you gotta have a QR code. and usually like the flyers, banners, all fly channels. I think one example was I remember like being on a train in what was China or Japan, I forgot, and like all the flyers have a QR code somewhere. Every single ad you see on a train, on a subway, there's a QR code, but you don't really see that here.
Oh right? Yeah, we're sitting here typing in a URL, like one letter.
Yeah,
it's not just inconvenient; it's prone to like easy transcription error. It's a pain in the butt, like all those things.
Yeah, right. So true.
So we're in 2023 now, right? Roaring 2021, which I know you experienced in NFT land. First couple months of 22, and then obviously the macro climate took over a little bit, right? And it's put a dampener on Web3. So 2021 and beginning of 22 couldn't miss. As a trader, as an investor, even as a project owner, you couldn't miss. Everything would mint out, all good, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, it was, it's partly the macro and then partly some just unfortunate events that happen, right? FTX, other things. Carolina. So we're here now, right? Given your experience with social media and just your perspective there, like, what do you think the pulse is currently of social media companies in general as it pertains to Web3? Would you put them in the camp of other Web2 companies and Web2 brands that are just aware of it and are like cautiously staying aware of it, but are just too nervous because it just has a black eye right now, and they're waiting for the next wave to start building in or consider building in, or what is your opinion on the pulse there?
Yeah, great question here. I would say the social media companies maybe a little bit more forward than, I guess, more further down the road than the traditional Web2 brands that they're thinking or already experimenting NFTs. I just feel, first, I think what social media companies just have they have more advantage than the traditional company, right? Firstly, from a tech perspective, right, they most likely already have existing engineering teams where they that are open to certain type of integrations, and the founders leaders usually more innovative and more open to experimenting new ideas. And then also the scale, a lot of the social media companies, it's usually much bigger than some of the CPG brands that we're seeing right now. And their reach is much broader in a way. So for them to adopt NFTs or just the Web3 in general, it just feels the barrier of entry, back to that buzzword, right? It's gonna be a lot easier, I would say. So that's like more the starting point, right? Like you have the right mindset, you have the technology ready, you have the number of users, the volume scale there. So what's next, right? And which is why you're now seeing a lot of those companies are like Twitter, right, Instagram, Reddit, and so on, are all trying to somehow integrate NFT into their product features, right? But none of them is really pulling a huge rollout, say, oh, we are launching a new NFT marketplace or something big, right? I think the reason for that is there is certainly a risk behind it. And I don't want to touch so much on the political side, but I think just on the regulation aspect, there's for any of these companies that owning so much data and access to their users, that it is a huge risk that if something happened and it's unregulated, what happens to how they're going to protect their users? If you see in the news, right, Meta, they're at the forefront for all the data related issues right in the past few years, and they're really struggling with it. And it's a huge cost for the company, right? So the cost on, not to mention just the legal fees alone, right? But there's reputation, people's trust on the company. I think that's being hurt as well as a result. So the opportunity cost there is really high. So what kind of benefit, what's the reward for them, right? For adding NFT feature, it's probably that doesn't outweigh the cost for them. So I think that's why you are seeing a much slower adoption from big companies like even Google, right? I think they talk about some NFT related feature with YouTube for quite some time as well. Like any of the big companies, you would think, yeah, they have all these teams, they can easily turn something on really quickly. But internally, there's going to be a ton of legal review, risk review, data review, right, that associates to any of those changes and implementations. That's so I think that's probably a reason why everyone's, I mean, personally too, right? Every time I go to an event, I get approached a lot by asking that sort of question too. But it's just harder for a bigger platform like this. I think there's the upside is, yes, we have all the users already on the social platforms, but the downside is, yes, with the users, greater, what's that term, like the greater responsibility that you have as a result. So so I think that's why we're seeing a slower adoption. But once all of those things I mentioned is ready, I think social media companies will probably going to be move really fast.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think there's that's a great explanation. And I think maybe building on top of what you're saying, I think there's also a little bit of public market pressure that exists, right? Because you consider like Facebook or Meta, right? Public. Twitter was, maybe not anymore, but they were, right? So now all of a sudden you have to talk to shareholders, and we saw an example of Facebook, Meta, when they swung the pendulum too far, which was, the starting point was before the macro was starting to become more of a problem. But when they swung the pendulum too far and started overspending in the metaverse, the investors did not like it. They did not take kindly to this. So I'd have to imagine that it's kind of a thing that they can't be waiting 100%. So you have to have the optionality and some business unit dedicated to this that's continuing, because you need to keep building in the background. But I'm sure they're just being intentionally very, very quiet about it for all the reasons you said, right? Of optics. those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I think for any new technology, there's always controversy, right? There's always shareholders don't, investors don't like it, and I say that even back in days when email first came out, right? It was for frauds. I mean, for like for. Yeah, I think you have to charge people for accessing email, and then just ton of spams, but then eventually we're adopting it, right? And now everyone's using it. I think it's just a matter of time, and also we have to wait till the return has to be higher than the cost, the investments, for that to make sense for most of these companies that we talk about, which are they all try to be profitable, right, in a way. So from a business standpoint, may not make sense for them to go big on Web3.
It's tricky. It seems like a bit of a tricky balance, right? Because, like, take for example, like the Meta, or choose another example. There are some businesses here who they're declining, or they're having issues, right? And if they don't move, if they don't change, right, somebody is going to eat their business, which might or might not have happened already to some extent, right? I won't name names, and not that it's any name of a place that you're working at, but this has already happened to some extent, right? So they're trying to innovate and they're trying to change, and yet the market doesn't like it because the market doesn't like change. So, or at least it doesn't like anything that's very new that's changed. So it's a tricky situation. Where do you think? So here's the dynamic we have, right? We have Facebook, who's still generating a good amount of revenue, but is having issues, right? We know it's been having issues for years at this point. We've got Twitter, who had issues and had cost side issues, and now has new leadership, and there's tension there. Some folks that like Twitter, it's part of the Web3 tech stack technically. People use Twitter a lot, but it's not exactly beloved. And then you have Mastodon entering, right? Where do you think this is going to shake out? Like, is Facebook and Meta going to continue and go towards the metaverse? And do you think they're going to solve it? Do you think all of these social media platforms are still going to be around in 2, 3, 4 years and succeeding possibly in Web3? Like, it's a very hard question, I realize, and just your opinion. But do you have any gut of where you think it's going to shake out?
Yeah, I thought about this a lot. I wish I had a good prediction for that. But I think eventually it will still fall between multiple players. I don't think there will be one single player that will win in the sole winner for that space. I think it will still be divided up between multiple ones. Depends on how people use how people interact in the Web3 space, right? So maybe I'm just putting out as an example, right? Maybe Twitter is better at communication on news, right? That sort of format, and so that's what people will be discussing most of the Web3 stuff on. But maybe for a platform like Instagram, it's more visual, and that's where you will be able to explore, learn about different artists and creators. But then when it comes to transaction, right? And where do people actually trade, right? Maybe it's OpenSea, right? Because they already built the technology behind it, and they're improving it. Or maybe that's, something else, right? Like Blur, right? Or something else. Yeah. So I think there will be multiple players. I don't see this as like there will be a winning super app for Web3. We already proved that in Web 2 and even Web 1 that there's no one single app that dominates all.
At least in the US and elsewhere.
Yeah.
In China,
right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Good point. A lot of super apps in Asia.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that, I guess that segues perfectly to my next question, which is, so it sounds like, and correct me if you disagree, but it sounds like you think the current tech stack, in quotes, right, of Web3 land, Twitter, Discord, OpenSea, or some combination of that, you think is pretty right? Like, you need to have something that's community oriented, which is here. You need to have something that maybe is news oriented, like a Twitter. You need to have a marketplace platform. So, a good example of this might be, it's not a perfect example, but a decent example might have been like Coinbase when they released their NFT platform, which enabled commenting, as like commenting on NFTs, commenting on trades. And I remember when that came out originally, and some folks within MVHQ took a look at it and beta tested it. And I feel like the visceral reaction was like, oh, this is kind of funny and weird, but I'm not sure there was intent to like ever adopt it. And I also get the sense that, and just again, my opinion, but I get the sense that folks didn't think it was necessarily in the right place. And it's not possible to necessarily integrate things like that, or very, very unclear, to be honest with you. So you think the tech stack now, like Twitter, Discord, OpenSea, that's, even though not perfect, pretty good in this scheme of things?
I don't think it's pretty good. Yeah, I honestly think there's still improvement needed. But at the same time, like we still don't know what's considered good yet. So it just requires a lot of iteration, experimentation. I think just from a tech standpoint, working in tech, right? A lot of time we try to ship things fast. So we're ahead of the curve, and then you start getting tractions, right? And then you made the product better. I think there's just many different philosophies of how you roll out new products. Sometimes you spend a lot of time to make it perfect. I think Coinbase could be an example. I don't think they want to make. I guess they try to make it perfect, right? So they spend a long time, build up the anticipation and everything, and eventually roll out that product like way later than we want it, right? But then it's still not perfect. But there's also other players that try to ship products ASAP. As long as there's a bare bone product there, right? And they can start collecting feedback from users and then start making improvements upon it. But that's a risky move too, right? Because if the product is not good, then you're not gonna get get people back, right? So that could be the tricky part. So it really depends on how they want to do it, and by the company, by the founders. But I don't think it's ready yet. But I don't think it's a bad thing that these companies are trying to roll out those features and start collecting feedback. And I'm sure they're reading all the feedback from people, from media, from reviews, so they can work on improving that. I think as long as they have the right PR marketing strategies and CRM strategies to keep those users engaged as they improve those product features.
I'm super curious based on what you just said to see, because that second category you were talking about, right? The kind of very crude, I don't want to even say agile intentionally, but a bit more agile approach is kind of like the defining feature of NFT projects that existed in the first push, right? Like they released with in some cases like half a roadmap and not even a product, right? Which is maybe a little bit too extreme for agile, I would say, but nonetheless, right? That's the theme that's existed. So I think what's super interesting to see is how these projects progress, what that tolerance level is that you're talking about, because many of these projects don't have CRMs, like you're saying. That's just not the way it operates, or it's very limited, if nothing else. And equally, even if they do, many of them don't have the news to be able to support a CRM because they just have not much to say, right? There's not new news. They don't have big enough development teams. That sort of. So I'm very, very, I don't know. I'm fascinated to see how that pans out, and where the tolerance is and patience is. Is it just decency and communication that solves that and creates more patience? I don't know. Any thoughts?
Yeah. That's why building companies is hard, right? You kind of have to find the right balance. I still think that's why you kind of need it's not just an engineering team, right? Not just a product team. I think what I remember having this conversation last year is East Denver with someone about this, where back for a long time, most of those Web3 projects are built by, of course, engineers, but only engineers. There's no product designers. So the product is really hard to use, right? Not good UI. There's no designers, no product managers. That's why they ship things, with half big roadmap. There's no good marketers or partnership BD people. That's why they're working on silo, right? So I think just but then now it's improving, right? So I would say finding the right balance. You kind of, once you're ready, having the right team, the right cross-functional team to help you move forward. It's just really important. For example, engineers will design a product like what engineers will want, right? That they may not be the most user-friendly one because they're so used to going through different steps. So how do we get better at it? And so I think it's hard to find a balance, but it really requires a lot of experimentations in this way.
Yeah, totally agreed. And I think we've all experienced, engineer-driven products versus design-driven trade-offs, definitely. Mm-hmm. I want to make sure, I want to be cognizant of your time, and I want to make sure that we get to turning the tables for those folks who are listening, who many of them are aspiring or existing social media stars out there, given your social media background. So I'm just curious to hear from you for them. How do you think of social media as a user? What advice would you have for them as aspiring or growing influencers? Any trends you've seen in terms of how to think about it, what people like, or just maybe like a mindset or framework that you have in mind?
Yeah, for social media, I would say you definitely want to be where the community is, right? So Twitter is certainly an important place to be. Other platforms like TikTok, right, where you're seeing more and more Web3 NFT content. So it's YouTube and Instagram, you name it. I think for what type of advice I would say, there's being in the right place, creating content that's native for that platform is also important. As you can see, right, that it's just like any Web2 content or any traditional content that you can't just copy paste what you already have on Twitter and put it on, make it a video into TikTok, right? You actually have to show, demonstration or saying something interesting, right? Be more interactive on TikTok. So, and that's sort of how we tell advertisers, right, when they want to buy ads on TikTok. You don't just bring a TV commercial cut down and put it on TikTok. And that's the same thing for you social media creators for Web3. You want to make sure you're speaking to the right audience. And then also, it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to attract more DJs, for example, yes, throw all the buzzwords as much as possible, right? I think say however you can, because we all understand what those means. But if, say, your audience is, for example, if you're working with let's say a Web2 brand launching a new NFT project, and then you're helping them get more buyers, more new NFT collectors, right? I think I saw, for example, Bud Light, right? If, say, you work with them and then helping them advertise their NFT project, then you might want to tone down your buzzword or your DJ vocabulary a little bit, because most people you want to drive are probably not the DJs. They probably are the people who like drinking Budweiser or like this brand, but it's their first time buying NFT, right? Then you might need a little bit more education why they need it. Oh, because all this, benefits you get. I think just the way how you tell the audience, you want to make sure you know who your audience is. So I think I would say those are probably my take there. Yeah.
That makes sense. That's great. That's great info, and I think should certainly help in terms of like framing thoughts in case anybody is continuing with NFT content or expanding. So very, very useful. Just one or two quick questions that I want to make sure we grab, follow-on questions from the audience, and then we'll wrap up. So maybe quick hit questions here. So given your background of having jumped into new technologies, ByteDance being an example, Amazon, what made you jump into NFT so early? And I guess more importantly, what are you so excited about in this space? Anything come to mind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, because I am growth-minded person, so I think I just like the trending stuff. I like the new technology, and when I see something with a good potential, I like to give it a try. Sometimes short, sometimes long, but with NFT in this case, right, it's long because I certainly see the potential. And especially the more I learn about it, the more I see the long-term benefits there will be for our entire, society. So that was really the main reason. Because NFT, I remember in the early days, a lot of questions I asked people were, what are some of the utilities behind it, right? Besides just owning the picture. And then I started getting, answers like, ticket holder, right, for a season pass for a game. That's one use case. Even if you buy a house, your contract, your home ownership could be on blockchain. A lot of those things are essentially they're NFTs, right? But there are different use cases beyond just the images. So I think once I had more understanding on those use cases, it really get me even more excited about the future of NFT.
That makes sense. That makes total sense. So a couple other quick hits and then we're done. Scott goes asking, when assessing a project, right, when deciding to mint, not mint, how important is VC backing for you as an investor, as a trader, when deciding to mint the project or not?
Honestly, it depends on what kind of VCs there are. I think at the end of the day, right, the same thing in Web2 world, VCs always have expectations on what you can deliver, right? So in Web2 world, there's not a lot of, there's never really a concept of, we will raise money by, selling NFTs. That's different way in Web3 now, where you can actually raise money through selling NFTs. So essentially, your collectors are the VC, except they're more like angel investors, not the big, venture capitalists, right? So I would say it's important, but I think it's just a new way of, I guess the equivalent for Web2 will be what Kickstarter, right? That's how we raise money, and then raise small portion, right? That's sort of how we do that here. So I think it depends on the scale of the company too, right? If you can raise millions of dollars just selling NFTs or other investments, and that's fine, then you may not need VC. But if you're looking to build a large product, and I think the VC, what's good about VC is that they also provide a lot of resource and connections for you. But at the same time, right, your community can do the same thing now in Web3. So I think there's pros and cons. Depends on the situation in your project.
So TLDR there, I guess, Scottco, is VCs in Web2, the parallel still exists, but also, wallet trackers, minting trackers, because that's a similar concept, right? Of people that are investing in this concept. So we're doing this, right? Last question from EQ. You can choose to answer this or not choose to answer it, whatever you're comfortable with. EQ's asking, could you share if there's any specific parameter that provides better visibility for posts on TikTok, whether it's having only a few but highly used hashtags or many that are tied into the topic? So we may be able to make that a general question if you're comfortable.
Yeah, I honestly use trending sounds, trending music, right? Those are what we always encourage. Hashtag is good. Don't be too generic on a hashtag, right? So be more specific, then you can get eyeballs. And the trending effects, that we have so many new effects these days if you pay attention. So use more of that. That's usually helpful too. So I think those will definitely drive higher visibility and views of TikTok.
Awesome. Well, this has been an excellent conversation. Thank you, Julia, so much for coming on and talking through so openly about what your perspective is. It's definitely a welcome vantage point. So really appreciate it. Excellent conversation. Everyone listening live, thank you so much as always. Really appreciate your support and your great questions. Similar time next week, and we'll continue the curriculum. It should be pretty awesome. We'll see everybody down in VC1. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed this call as well. Awesome. I hope I address all the questions. If there's anything else, feel free to type them up on Discord. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you. Great work. It was awesome. Thank you, Aslo, as always. That was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, so good. So good. Thanks, Poop. Thanks, EQ and the rest of the team. Much appreciated, like always.